There were two incidents where you almost lost your life.
M16 round went through my chest, and so luckily it went over the A in Petraeus rather than the A in Army.
And to get out of the hospital, they didn't want you to leave that soon, so you showed them you could do push-ups. You did 50 push-ups.
It's the only time I've ever stopped at 50, David. No,
Okay.
no. I mean,
You had never before had people working for you directly who were killed in combat.
it's a chilling experience.
President Obama calls you into the Oval Office.
If the president calls on you and asks you to do something, I think you do it.
Would you fix your tie, please?
Well, people wouldn't recognize me if my tie was fixed, but okay. Just leave it this way. All right. I don't consider myself a journalist, and nobody else would consider myself a journalist. I began to take on the life of being an interviewer, even though I have a day job running a private equity firm. How do you define leadership? What is it that makes somebody tick?
General, thank you very much for coming.
Pleasure, thanks. Great to be with you.
Now, you served our country very honorably for quite a while in government, and we're going to talk about that, but now you're in something that I consider a higher calling of mankind, private equity. How do you compare being in the military and leading troops to private equity?
Well, I'm not sure I would agree wholeheartedly with that, although I feel very privileged to be in the private equity business and also to be active in academia, in speaking with startups and so forth. I think it's pretty hard to top the extraordinary privilege of serving one country in uniform, particularly if you're leading our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines in combat.
You're very famous for staying in shape. Now, you told me this morning you already exercised an hour and a half this morning. I do an hour and a half a year if I'm lucky, but...
we can talk.
So, like you're living in New York right now. When you're in New York, you run around Central Park every...
Yep.
How hard is that?
6.2 miles, actually.
And do people recognize you, and they say they cheer you on?
Not as much when you're running. If you wear sunglasses and a hat, you can generally run unimpeded and unrecognized. Folks are very kind to me walking the streets. Can I actually just ask, though, if the veterans in this audience would please stand up so that we can recognize you and thank you for what you've done for our country while in uniform?
Veterans?
Thank you very much. You know, David, I've often said that those who have served, particularly the post 9/11 generation, all of whom are volunteers, all raised the right hand, took an oath at a time of war, knowing that they would likely be asked to deploy to a combat zone. And I've often described them as America's new greatest generation, something that actually Tom Brokaw shouted in my ears after he saw our soldiers in the first year in Iraq when I was privileged to be the commander of the 101st Airborne Division up in Mosul. And he saw all that they were doing, the myriad tasks, everything from combat to helping rebuild cities that had been damaged during the war, or looting, or all of these different tasks. And he said, you know, that World War II crowd was the greatest generation, but surely the young men and women we've seen today are America's new greatest generation, and I very much believe in that.
All right, well, let's talk about how you came into the military. Your father was a Dutch sea captain.
Yes.
And he met your mother, who was from Brooklyn.
Yep.
And they met at a church service or church social. Yep. And he later stayed here during World War II
Yes.
and became a commander of a U.S. merchant marine ship.
During the war, he sailed with the U.S. Merchant Marine, long war, because they all signed on. I think it was in '39 when the Nazis overran Holland. They couldn't go; their ship couldn't go back to Rotterdam, so they came to the.
Okay, so you grew
States.
up in New York City or in?
No, about 50 miles north of here, about 7 miles north of West Point. In fact, I could actually run home from West Point to and from.
So when you were growing up, what was your nickname growing up?
Peaches. An announcer at a Little League game couldn't pronounce it. The first time I came to bat as a 9-year-old, he said, Peaches, and that sort of stuck. And it followed me for all the way through my time at West Point, in fact. There was a woman or girl in the laundry who had been a high school friend of mine doing that as a summer job, and she would send me notes in the laundry that you'd send to and from every week. And some upperclassmen opened it up, and it said "Dear Peaches," and so
it stuck with
it
you.
jumped to West Point. It jumped the air gap to West Point.
How did you get an appointment to West Point? Obviously, you seemed like you were qualified. You were a good athlete, and I assume you were a good scholar, but somebody has to call a member of Congress to get you in.
Well, you just make an application, you write your congressman, and the congressman nominates you, and I mean, it's obviously a competitive process.
Suppose you hadn't gotten in, where would you have gone to college, do you know?
Colgate, I had a full ride there for soccer and academics.
Okay, you ever thought how your life would be different if you'd gone there?
Not only did I think about it, I almost, at the end of 2 years at West Point, we had this spectacular summer where I was up in Alaska, mountain climbing, glaciers, rivers, and so forth. First in a training course, then with an actual unit. So this was our summer training. And then I went down to Los Angeles, and a friend of mine who lived in the hills out over there looking over Los Angeles and had such an extraordinary experience. I decided, should I really go back to West Point for the remaining years, or should I enjoy more of this? In the end, I went back, obviously.
At West Point, did you play on the soccer team and ski team
I was a
as
soccer
well?
team and a skier.
You also were a scholar. You graduated near the top of your class. So when you graduated, did you decide you wanted to make the military your career?
I just wasn't sure. I think, it's, what was interesting is, of all things at West Point, I was in the pre-med program, and I loved that particular body of academic inquiry. But I think it was also that it was the highest academic peak to scale, and it was sort of known as the toughest. All of a sudden, I found myself in the senior year with an actual slot in the program. And I realized at that time I wasn't absolutely certain that I truly wanted to be a doctor. I just wanted to sort of climb that mountain. So then I picked infantry instead, and had a wonderful, wonderful experience.
You got married just a few weeks after you graduated to the daughter of the commandant of the West Point. Now, isn't that
Actually,
kind
the
of
superintendent is the overarching
Okay.
guy.
So isn't that kind of,
three-star general? It was a strange blind date, I must say, when I found out.
But it wasn't nerve-wracking? You're dating the superintendent's daughter. Wasn't that complicated?
Well, we tried to do it clandestinely for a while. That was not very successful.
all right.
And I took a lot of flack over that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a particular general's march that they play at parades that goes do 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 do. And one of my classmates, I was on the brigade staff, so we were a little way from the crowd. One of my classmates would sing, my son-in-law, do, 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 do. So yeah, I took a little flack.
So you graduated and you went into the infantry, and you were working your way up, and then there were two incidents that occurred where you almost lost your life or you were severely damaged, not in combat.
Yeah, this is a pretty aggressive live fire exercise, a maneuver live fire
Very
exercise,
aggressive,
live grenades, supporting machine gun fire and all the rest of that. We were following, in fact, General Keane, who is a one-star general, ultimately the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army 4-star, was with me when we were walking behind the soldiers. One of them knocked out a bunker, spun out of it, tripped, fell down, and we think as he did, he probably squeezed, because you tense up when you're about to take a blow, and a M16 round went through my chest. And so luckily it went over the A in Petraeus rather than the A in Army.
So what happened? You had a bullet in there, and
Well, obviously medics start working on you. Interestingly, shock sets in, and I initially said, hey guys, don't worry, just go ahead, do a quick after-action review, figure out what went wrong, and drive on, and they're sort of all rolling their eyes. And so they get an IV running, you get a medevac aircraft in, they picked me up. Keane went with me, held my hand the whole way, went into the hospital, and in fact it had nicked an artery but not severed it. If it severed it, you bleed out. You're finished very quickly. So it's one of the times when someone turned to me and said, a doctor said, this is really going to hurt. And he took a scalpel and cut an X in my side right down to the ribs, pulled it back and shoved a plastic tube right into the lung to try to get suction so that the fluid is draining, and it was. And that really is what I think saved my life. And then I was put back in a helicopter flown down to Vanderbilt Medical Center. And of all people, they called in, the surgeon on call that day was Bill Frist, Dr. Bill Frist. And he came in later, of course, the majority leader of the Senate. And some people have jokingly said, yeah, Petraeus was dying to meet Bill Frist. And he did thoracic surgery, and I was out of the hospital in about 5 or 6 days.
And to get out of the hospital, they didn't want you to leave that soon, so you showed them you could do push-ups. You did 50 push-ups to make sure that they knew you were okay. Is that right?
It's the only time I've ever stopped at 50, David. No,
Okay.
no. I mean,
Okay. I've never gotten a 50.
So yeah, no, like I wanted to get out of there, and I was, things were fine. There was no reason to keep hanging around. I was doing laps around the hospital. I'd put all my tubes in a wheelchair and push it around. And I think that was driving them crazy.
So the other incident was you were skydiving, and
Yep.
your parachute didn't quite work, I guess, and you broke your pelvis. What is that like? Is that life-defying
That's
as well?
horrific. That was actually worse in terms of pain because it fractured front and rear, and your body is literally in two parts, and anything that touches, and I rode an ambulance all the way in, and every single crack in the street, not just bump, was agony.
Did you ever skydive after that, or?
I was told by the Army, General Keane, in fact, who was by then a 4-star, he said, "Dave, no more skydiving." And I said, "Okay, you give me a division command and I'll quit skydiving."
Okay. So they gave you a command,
Yeah,
and
I was very privileged.
you had never before had people working for you directly who were killed in combat.
It's a chilling experience. I remember the radio call when our first soldier was killed, and it takes the wind out of you.
You had a number of important jobs in the military, but then ultimately the decision was made by President Bush to invade Iraq, and you became a commander there, and you went over there as the first part of the military that went into that. It was supposed to be relatively quick. When did you realize this isn't going to be as easy as we had thought?
Well, first of all, we did actually, in a matter of weeks, topple the regime, although there was stiffer fighting along the way in various points, and certainly what was predicted by a variety of different folks prior to the invasion, which was that, the Iraqi units were all going to surrender and come over to our side, and then they'd help us establish order and so forth, did not prove out. There was tough fighting along the way, and I had a nagging sense fairly early on, probably certainly in the first week, once that dust storm blew through. And I had Rick Atkinson, the Washington Post reporter, Pulitzer Prize winner, riding in the back of my Humvee. And I remember turning to him at one point and asked, "Tell me how this ends, because I'm not sure this is going to go according to script." The idea that we're just going to topple Saddam and his sons and his few henchmen, and then everybody else will stay in place, and there'll be a little bit of a political negotiation, and we'll hand it over to them, obviously proved misfounded.
But do you think it would have been different had we not decided to get rid of the entire Saddam army and the de-Baathification process?
These were huge mistakes. We used to have a question on the operations center wall when I was a division commander in other positions, and it asked, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? And the same is true of policies. And the fact is that firing the military without telling them what their future was, this meant you're taking tens of thousands of people, and there's no reconciliation process agreed. So you've just created tens of thousands of people whose incentive is to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support that.
You led the effort to get control of Mosul, is that right?
We were in Baghdad, which is where we'd been told we were going to end up. And then all of a sudden we got this sort of emergency order to get up to Mosul. It's out of control. There's a small U.S. unit up there. There'd been 17 civilians killed in responding to a riot. So within about 36 hours or so, we did one of the biggest air assaults in history up to Mosul. We had 250 helicopters or so in the 101st Airborne. We immediately blanketed the city with our soldiers, just literally pushed right into the city, calmed it down, stopped the looting and all the rest of that, and then gradually took control of it. And then we actually had an interim government up there within 2 weeks of arriving.
You may remember, I think early on in the war, it was thought that shock and awe would be all that was necessary. All we have to do is show a lot of missiles going off, and that was going to be the end of the war. That concept doesn't really work.
That didn't completely succeed. I think it did impose a little awe here and there, but again, there were some folks certainly fighting, shooting at us, and we had casualties and lost heavy equipment and everything else.
When President Bush decided to invade Iraq, in part it was because of the theory that they had weapons of mass destruction.
Right.
And that information came from the CIA, among other places. When you became the head of the CIA, did you ever dig into it and say, where did you get that information from?
I didn't dig into that as much as I dug into some other issues, such as the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, something which I've personally opposed for two reasons. One is I think it's wrong, and I think it's beyond the if you will, international law and Geneva Convention and so forth. Number two is I just don't think it's as effective as the so-called proponents of it believe it is. As Jim Mattis, again, colorfully said, give me a beer and a cigarette and I'll get more information than by waterboarding. It's not quite that simple, but to put it, I guess, more simply, it would be that you want to become the detainee's best friend in detention. The interrogator does. And I say this having been the commander who oversaw the holding of more detainees in Iraq than at any other time, 27,000 of them. So we have some experience with what works with detainees, and treating them humanely while still eliciting information from them is the way to go about it, and then the most in Afghanistan as well.
Now, you had never before had people working for you directly who were killed in combat. Now, this experience had people working for you. What was that like to have the command of people who are dying?
It's it's a chilling experience, actually. The first time, I remember the radio call when our first soldier was killed, and it takes the wind out of you. I remember hearing when a sister unit, the 3rd Infantry Division, which really spearheaded the fight, along with a Marine Division up to Baghdad on the ground with tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. So I remember the radio call. I was monitoring their net because we were all fighting together, and hearing that they'd had a couple of heavy vehicles blown up. It's a chilling.
You were there for how long before you were sent back to the States?
That was about a year-long deployment, and then I was back for a couple months and was asked to go back over very quickly to do an assessment for a couple of weeks for the Commander, Central Command, and the Secretary of Defense of the Iraqi Security Force effort. Came back, reported out to Secretary Rumsfeld, and he said, "Great report. Now go back, change out of your division, get back over there, and do what you've recommended that we do."
So have you thought if you hadn't written such a good report, maybe you wouldn't have been sent back, or they never thought that?
Secretary Rumsfeld had an interesting way of giving rewards, because later on, so that was the next tour, was a 15-and-a-half-month tour. I remember in the final week or so, he came over and he was literally patting me on the back, and I thought, this is really sort of nice. And then he said, and on the way home, I want you to come through Afghanistan. I said, that's not exactly the direct line between 2 points here, but so we did an assessment over there for him on the way home, actually.
President Obama calls you into the Oval Office and says, "I'd like you to give up the Central Command and go back and be a military commander in Afghanistan." What did you think about that?
If the president calls on you and asks you to do something, I think you do it.
You didn't say, "Well, let me think about it, give me a few minutes." You don't do that. You just say,
No.
You finished your second tour of duty in Iraq. You went back to the United States.
Yeah, then we had about 15 months at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, commanding the Combined Arms Center, which has a number of different hats that individual wears. You control the Army's doctrine a lot. It's really quite an extraordinary command. And we really revamped the whole process of preparing units, soldiers, and their leaders to go to Iraq and to Afghanistan. And we did the counterinsurgency field manual, which was sort of the intellectual foundation for that.
Once again, you wrote a very good report. You oversaw the counterinsurgency manual, and it was so good that people said maybe this person could be in charge of the current counterinsurgency effort. So you were asked by President Bush to go back and lead the so-called surge.
Right.
Now, when he said, "I'd like you to go lead the surge," did you say, "I've already served 2 tours of duty in Iraq and I don't need to go back a 3rd time," or what did you say?
No, you say it'd be a privilege to do that, and it's the same thing I said when President Obama sat me down, I don't know, several years later, and said, with no pleasantries and no one else in the room except for a photographer, he said, "I'm asking you as your commander-in-chief to go to Afghanistan, take command of the International Security Assistance Force." So I think the only answer at a time like that can be
What I didn't understand at the time was how many troops did we have in Iraq at the time that you went back with the surge?
We had about 140,000 U.S. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. Coalition had some tens of thousands of additional. And then we added about 25 to 30,000 additional forces during the surge. And if I could, I'd just point out, and in fact, I'm sure there are some surge veterans in here who will validate this. The surge that mattered most was not the surge of forces, it was the surge of ideas. It was the change in strategy.
Yes, that's the point.
Complete change. It was really a 180-degree shift from consolidating on big bases and getting out of the, quote, faces of the Iraqi people to going back and living in the neighborhood with them, because that's the only way you can secure them. From realizing that you cannot kill or capture your way out of an industrial strength insurgency. You have to reconcile with as many as you can. From handing off to Iraqi forces that couldn't handle the escalating level of violence after the Samarra mosque bombing in February of 2006, to actually taking back over. We created 77 additional locations just in the Baghdad divisional area of responsibility alone during the course of the surge.
So we had about 140,000 American troops. We sent over additional 25 to 30,000, and that was enough, given the techniques you used, to bring it to a stable position, relatively speaking.
Well, dramatically reduced violence. I mean, violence was reduced by some 80 to 85% during the course of an 18-month period, which was about the duration of the surge.
So after 18 months, you came back?
No, I came back about 19 and a half months after that, and then went to U.S. Central Command.
Okay, so the President asked you to head the U.S. Central Command, and the U.S. Central Command is in charge of U.S. military operations, I guess, in the Middle East?
It's 20 countries. It's from Egypt in the west to Pakistan in the east, Kazakhstan in the north to Yemen and the pirate-infested waters off Somalia in the south. We were very proud that it had 90% of the world's problems at the time.
After you head one of these commands, usually, not always, somebody gets to rise up to be the chairman of the Army Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then maybe chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So you're kind of rising up, and then one day, President Obama calls you into the Oval Office and says, I'd like you to give up the Central Command and go back and be a military commander in Afghanistan. What did you think about that?
You know, if the president calls on you and asks you to do something, I think you do it.
You didn't say, well, let me think about it, give me a few minutes. You don't do that. You just say...
No. I mean, I think you say the only answer to a question like that can be yes. Now, I will say that in that case, and actually prior, it was actually Secretary Gates who was the one who called me. I was actually on leave. It was the last time I saw my father before I went to the surge. We were on a freeway outside LA driving to where he lived in a retirement home, and took the call from Secretary Gates. In each case, I actually wanted to have a little bit more of a conversation and just say, I'd like you to understand who you're getting as your commander, because my advice on when it comes to drawing forces down and so forth will be based on the facts on the ground, with an understanding of the mission that you have assigned us, on which we'll have dialogue, informed by an awareness of all these other issues with which you have to deal legitimately. Congressional politics, domestic politics, coalition politics, budget deficits, you name it, but driven by facts on the ground. And that's important, because what I'm basically saying is, I'm going to give it to you straight. I'm not changing it based on, issues you have to deal with, although I will obviously support the decision that you ultimately make.
You went to Afghanistan. You spent about 12, 13 months there?
Little over 12 and a half months, I think.
And what did you conclude? Did we really have an effort to successfully get rid of the Taliban or reduce their impact, or not?
Well, I said in Congress, actually in my confirmation hearing, that we would not be able to flip Afghanistan the way we flipped Iraq, if you see what I mean. You can't. I really did believe we could do in Iraq what we ultimately did. What was eating at me all the time was whether we could do it fast enough, whether we could have sufficient results to report in September of 2007, 6 months into the surge in Iraq, or not. And that was crucial, because the congressional support was very tenuous. And we did. And we reduced violence very dramatically, and it continued to be reduced. And it was sustained in Iraq for a good 3.5 years until, unfortunately, tragically, the Prime Minister undid it with highly sectarian actions. In the case of Afghanistan, I was under no illusions that we would be able to replicate what we had done in Iraq. The circumstances are very different. I'd actually laid out for the Secretary of Defense, after that Afghan assessment that Secretary Rumsfeld asked me to do, the very first slide in that briefing. Of course, PowerPoint is the means of communication of all the modern general. It said Afghanistan does not equal Iraq. So there was not going to be the prospect of a dramatic improvement. But what our mission was in that year, and which we did accomplish, it was to halt the momentum of the Taliban, because they were on the march, to reverse it in some key areas, to accelerate the development of the Afghan security forces and select Afghan institutions so that we could begin transition of some tasks, which we did, all while achieving the overarching goal, which is still a very, very valid and important mission for the United States in Afghanistan. That is to ensure that Afghanistan is never again a sanctuary for transnational extremists the way it was when Al-Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks there and conducted the initial training there.
You've briefed President Bush 43, and you briefed many times President Obama. If they're both taking an SAT test, who would do better?
I don't
not
grade
gonna-
the presidents that I served.
And who was a better athlete? Did you ever exercise with either of them?
President Bush, he could talk trash, by the way. He said, "So General, when are you going to have the guts to ride a mountain bike with me?" I said, "I'm going to give you an experience that you can write off on your income tax as education."
While you were in Afghanistan, the effort to capture Osama bin Laden was going forward.
Capture or kill.
Capture or kill. How were you alerted to that? Because you weren't directly in the chain of command for that decision.
Yeah. That night, no one else in our headquarters knew at all. And I got up myself, no aides, no anything else. Went into we had a Joint Special Operations Command post at the NATO headquarters in Kabul where I was located. I went in there, sort of surprised them at about 11 or so at night. Said, "What are you doing in here?" And I asked everybody to leave except for one officer who I knew very, very well. And we then dialed up so that we could monitor the operation. We had a lot of contingency plans. And the forces that conducted it, some of those at least, the headquarters element at least, was working for me in normal times, but that night they were working actually for the CIA, because it was a CIA, it was a covert action, which means the chain of command runs from the president to the director of the CIA, Leon Panetta, then to Admiral McRaven, and then to the SEAL Team 6 unit, as is well known, did the operation.
So did you have a view subsequently that the Pakistan military or their own Secret Service or intelligence forces knew that Osama bin Laden was living there?
No. In fact, I don't think they did. I'm really pretty convinced of that. I think Leon Panetta supports that, as do others.
You're in Afghanistan. After about 12 and a half months, the president says, "I'd like you to come back and be the head of the CIA."
Yep.
And doing that meant you had to give up your military career, essentially. You had to...
Yeah, I didn't have to, but I chose to. And I thought, in fact, the president and I talked about that when he finally made the decision to nominate me for that. And I agreed that that would be the best approach. I thought it was very important not to have folks think that I was going to turn this place into a military headquarters. I literally showed up the first day, and I said that I would do that with no one but the security guys that from
Was
the
it
CIA.
emotional to give up your military career at that point?
It's always emotional to take the uniform off for the last time, without question, and it was a wonderful sort of retirement parade and experience. But you have the prospect of this extraordinary new opportunity that was very exciting. The CIA is just an incredible group of men and women, the silent warriors, as we term them. They also have raised their hand, taken an oath at a time of war, and they know they're not going to get a parade. There's nothing public about what they do. They can't even have the joy that most of us have of talking about what it is they do on a daily basis.
So when you get to the CIA, do you say, well, these are all the secrets the country has, and Jesus, aren't as many secrets as I thought? Or you say, these are incredible secrets, which do you think?
On a near daily basis, really almost throughout my time there, it was one of those, are you kidding me?
Right.
Seriously? Really? So yeah, there's some extraordinary secrets there.
Oh, so did you...
And by the way, those who think that we don't know how to recruit spies anymore, or all we're doing is relying on satellites or something like that, couldn't be more wrong. There's an incredibly talented clandestine services operation that is really exceptional.
When you're at the CIA and you're then not a policymaker, but you're involved in the policy process, how did you look at the government then as compared to being in the military?
I think in each case you have input. Certainly if you're the commander of a theater of war, of Iraq or Afghanistan, there's certainly no one who has a bigger voice, if you will, when it comes to assessments, options, and recommendations. It's more significant than the Central Command commander in that regard, and the same is true of the CIA. Now, keep in mind that your role at the Situation Room table is twofold. One, it is, together with the Director of National Intelligence, to provide the intelligence analysis to present what your analysts have determined. And occasionally, and the president asked me to do this, he said, "Have you ever disagreed with the analysts?" Which I'd done 3 times as a 4-star battlefield commander. I broke with the intelligence community on national intelligence estimates. That's a pretty big deal. Now, in each case, there's generally a reason for it. One of them was in the surge, they had to cut their data off 4 or 5 weeks before I did. Another time, but we saw
So
something.
when you disagree with
But you can, so he said, look, if you disagree, I want you to give me what the analysts say, but also give me your own view. I mean, I had more time with Prime Minister Maliki than the analysts did. Or
when you
President
disagree with the
Karzai or
analysts, do you ever
something.
worry about a covert operation on you that they might perform?
No.
Don't worry about that.
The analysts like this. The analysts want somebody who engages them in,
Right.
and it was, you know, it's fun. I mean, the analysts would come in and say, "Hey, today we're going to talk about the Prime Minister of Iraq." I'd say, "Great, you ever met him?" They say, "Well, no, but you know," and I say, "Okay, give it your best shot."
You've briefed President Bush 43, and you briefed many times President Obama. So what's the difference between the two in briefing them?
Well, first of all, you have to keep in mind that the Bush 43 I briefed most significantly on a weekly basis, in fact, together with my great diplomatic partner, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, during the surge in Iraq. We had a weekly video teleconference for an hour every Monday morning, 7:30 Eastern Standard Time, President with his national security team around the Situation Room, video conferencing directly with us. And he had, you know, he'd gone all in on the surge. He had put it all on the line. He'd frankly overridden the advice of most of his advisors. Very few people were really strongly behind the surge. General Keane, by the way, was one of those. So he was absolutely intimately involved in this. And the next day, he did a video conference with the Prime Minister of Iraq each week. So it was a different circumstance. We weren't doing the surge in Iraq anymore by the time President Obama arrives. Iraq was really in a pretty good place, and it was just in a process. The question was, how quickly can we draw down without jeopardizing what we fought and sacrificed so hard to achieve? You know, President Obama famously does his homework, studies it, deliberates it. The Afghan policy review that was conducted in the latter part of his first year was extraordinary. I don't think any president has ever engaged the national security team, whatever it was, 9 or 10 times directly. And that before each one of those, there's a deputies committee and a principals committee.
So if they were both
very exhaustive.
They're both taking an SAT test. Who would do better?
I don't
not
grade
gonna-
the presidents that I served in that way.
All right. And who was a better athlete? Did you ever exercise with either of them?
It depends on the sport. You know, I think that President Bush would humbly, actually, he could talk trash, by the way, and he did with me. He challenged me. I was in the Oval Office with my family after the surge in Iraq, and he said, "So, General, when are you going to have the guts to ride a mountain bike with me?" And I said, "Mr. President, you have any idea who you're talking to?" I said, "I'm going to give you an experience that you can write off on your income tax as education."
Did you ever do it with him?
I did, and I was
is he
glued
good at
to,
it?
I was glued to it. He's terrific. Yeah, and he also knew the course. He had the best bike in the world. He had, and I had a borrowed clunker. I was a road biker, but Secret Service will ditch you if you try to pass him. So, but it was
I guess, yeah. it
our
must be
son broke
challenging.
his thumb on. I mean, this is a full contact sport when you ride with President Bush, and you go from 4 wides like NASCAR to single track. It's always sporty. But President Obama, obviously, famously a great basketball player, and I don't think that President Bush had any illusions that he could take President Obama one-on-one full court.
What is your view about the importance of NATO?
It can thank Vladimir Putin for giving it, you know, a rebirth in some respects.
The Russians probably interfered with our recent presidential election.
They're trying to undermine the trust of the people in our system, and that is a major issue.
You're at the CIA, and then because of a personal mistake you conceded that you made, you stepped down and you voluntarily left the CIA. Would you ever go back in another administration?
I wouldn't rule it out. Again, I think it's an extraordinary privilege to serve one's country, and so I think, again, for the right position with the right sort of context and so forth, in a sense, the right conditions, it's not something that I would rule out.
Would you consider running for president of the United States?
No, and I said I'd never run back before I left government. In fact, I actually went to one of the White House chiefs of staff one time under President Obama, Rahm Emanuel, because there was this buzz that Petraeus is running for office.
Right.
Be careful, be suspicious. He's setting himself up to run in the next election. And I actually politely grabbed Rahm and I said, Rahm, I am not running for President of the United States. Please understand that. I tried truly to be nonpartisan, not just bipartisan.
Imagine,
but
what word did he
nonpartisan.
use when you,
So-
he used the famous
Well,
word
I
that he
used
used?
a word as well, and
Okay,
then
all
he
right.
used another word.
Okay,
But,
so, all right,
you know,
so
infantrymen have some degree of familiarity with those words.
let's talk about the world right now and where it stands. What is your view about the importance of NATO and what should be done to improve NATO?
Well, I very much agree with my old Marine buddy and shipmate, if you will, Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, when he said if NATO didn't exist, it would have to be invented. I think it's a hugely important organization. It served an extraordinary role during the Cold War. The wall came down, and it continued to serve an extraordinary role. And I think that it has a new reason for living now. I mean, it can thank Vladimir Putin for giving it, a rebirth in some respects in terms of its importance. There's no question. I think President Trump is right that there are countries that are not paying their dues, if you were, not doing all that they should. The countries agreed that they should all pay at least 2% of their GDP for defense, and a number of countries still have some work to do to get to that threshold.
Well, let me ask you about this. It is reported by many people that the Russians probably interfered or tried to interfere with our recent presidential election.
I don't think there's any question about that. I don't think anyone in the intelligence community has had any questions. Essentially what they're trying to do, arguable whether they're literally trying to change the results or not the results, but to change how people might see one candidate or the other. But certainly we're trying to undermine the trust of the people in our system, and that is a major issue.
Well, in terms of Iraq, where do you think Iraq is today? Is Iraq stable today?
Well, Iraq is the situation is obviously improving. With our help, the Iraqi security forces have been reconstituted, retrained, re-equipped. We're enabling them now with the so-called intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, drones, precision strike, and the industrial strength ability to fuse intelligence, gradually taking back from the Islamic State those areas that they seized. Will eventually defeat the Islamic State that is the army in Iraq. We'll have to then help the Iraqis security forces focus on the residual insurgent and guerrilla elements and the terrorist cells. But really the issue is not these battles. I've said for 2 years, even from the darkest days, that ultimately the Iraqis would prevail in this with our assistance and that of our coalition partners. The real issue is the battle after the battle. It's very, very challenging in that regard. It's not just Sunni and Shia Arabs, there are Kurds from several different parties now. All of those have to feel that they are represented in the new government, that new government is within means responsive to their needs, and most importantly, that minority rights are guaranteed as well as majority rule. And that's of tall order. The Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi, no question that he wants to have inclusive governance rather than exclusive. It was the exclusive, it was alienating the Sunni Arabs that created the fertile fields for the planting of the seeds of extremism and the rise of ISIS. And the question is, will there be fertile fields again from which ISIS 3.0 will arise or not?
Let's talk about Syria for a moment.
Yep.
In Syria, there seems to be an ongoing war that doesn't seem to have any end. What would you recommend to the President of the United States if he asked you what we should now do with Syria?
Well, first of all, they're actually doing a fair amount of what I would recommend. And to be fair, the Obama administration in the final 6 to 12 months really made a number of steps. You can argue that it took too long, that it was grudging or what have you, but ultimately did take a number of steps, albeit to defeat the Islamic State as the focus. And I think now that beyond that objective of defeating ISIS and the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, the other objective should be to stop the bloodshed. Recognize that the diplomatic effort to create some kind of an agreement that will result in a democratically elected, multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian government in Damascus for all of Syria is probably beyond reach now. So look at what kinds of interim solutions on the ground could be established, could be achieved, so that you stop the bloodshed, stop the further flow of refugees, bring some of those back, and try to stabilize the situation.
What about the Iranian agreement that was negotiated under President Obama? Do you support that agreement? Do you think it's working?
Well, more importantly, I don't support walking away from it without enormous reason for that. I fear that if we left it without that, we would be more likely to isolate ourselves than to isolate Iran.
We've been in Afghanistan in military combat longer than any other war in our history. Do you see any prospect of our getting all of our troops out of Afghanistan in the foreseeable future?
Not in the foreseeable future. In fact, I think that what we should do in Afghanistan is make a sustained commitment to Afghanistan. Stop the year-on-year agony over how we can draw it down further. In fact, I actually think that we've drawn down a bit too far, and it would be great to have another, if you take all the coalition forces, say 5,000 additional forces, back on the ground. We're doing some foolish things because of these troop caps. There's an aviation brigade that's deployed out there, all the helicopters and pilots, obviously. They had to leave their maintenance crews behind, which means you pay very high contract costs to bring in civilian contractors to maintain the helicopters, and you fractured unit integrity because the maintainers are sitting back in the heartland of the United States without helicopters to work on while their comrades are actually at war and need them. So we got to think our way through that. Again, there's no blank check ever, and the Afghans shouldn't think that they have that by any means. They have to deliver, but they are very much fighting and dying for their country. We need to continue to enable them, because that mission that I talked about earlier of ensuring that Afghanistan is never again a sanctuary for transnational extremists the way it was when the 9/11 attacks were planned there is still very valid.
And what about Kim Jong-un? Nobody in the American government has ever met him. We really don't know much about him. What do you think he's trying to do?
Well, he's trying to build himself as quickly as he can a deterrent that will enable him to stay in power and to continue the legacy passed on to him from his father and his grandfather. The challenge for this is that this is the crisis to prevent a madman, in many people's eyes, from getting a nuclear capability that can actually reach the United States. So this is a very real threat, and it's one that confronts President Trump uniquely. I don't think any president has ever had that particular prospect. Yes, they were developing a nuclear program. Yes, they had some delivery means, but if they get an intercontinental ballistic missile and can miniaturize and put a nuclear device on it, that presents a very significant threat to the United States, and the president may be confronted by that most difficult of decisions.
What political leaders do you most admire?
I'm a particular great fan of Teddy Roosevelt. The man in the arena speech has always captured me. The credit belongs to the man in the arena whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. At least if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly.
Let's talk a moment about leadership. You are considered one of the great military leaders of our generation, and maybe of any other generation. What is leadership to you?
Well, I think leadership has 4 tasks. It's particularly true at the strategic level. So if you're commanding Iraq or Afghanistan, that kind of situation, the Carlyle Group, you have to get the big ideas right, got to get the strategy right. You have to communicate them effectively through the breadth and depth of your organization. You have to oversee their implementation, and all these have subtasks, of course. This has metrics, it has your battle rhythm, how do you spend your own time. We had a whole matrix all the way out for 3 months of how we did that. And then, most importantly, in a task that's often forgotten, you have to have a formal process for determining how the big ideas need to be revised, refined, maybe shot and left on the side of the road intellectually, and do it all again and again and again. And it's very true in the civilian world as well. Think of Netflix. 3 times they've gotten this right. They decided early on that we're going to put Blockbuster out of business by mailing CDs to people, work all the way through that. Then they see down here, oh, okay, Blockbuster's out of business, and now others are doing this. So now the connectivity is fast enough we can stream the videos out to them and download them. They do all that, then they realize, okay, others are doing that, and then they make a huge bet. I think it was $100 million on House of Cards and others. We're going to provide content. And so Reed Hastings, a truly admirable and innovative, impressive leader, continues to get it right.
In the military, who are the military leaders you've most admired over time?
Well, I think that Ulysses S. Grant is hugely underrated, although now I think finally he's once again getting his due. He was the hero of the world, really, after he left the White House and traveled the world on this famous tour. wrote fantastic memoirs. And then the Southern historians ran him down for the first 50 years of the past century. But gradually, regard has returned. And there's a terrific biography by Ron White, who I interviewed at the 92nd Street Y and University of Southern California, titled American Ulysses. It's a wonderful title. He really was America's Ulysses in many respects. And now Ron Chernow of Hamilton fame, his biography will be out in mid-October as well. Grant was the only general, I believe, in U.S. history who was brilliant tactically, division level and below. This is the battles of Donelson and Henry, the land between the lakes. Brilliant operationally, so now it's many divisions, but not yet the whole theater. At Vicksburg, one of the greatest maneuver campaigns of all times. And then strategically, when he charted the strategy for the entire Union force, because people forget, this was not inevitable. You know, the idea that the Union forces were just ultimately going to grind down the South was not inevitable until Grant made it so. Had there not been for that strategy and the victory of Sherman at Atlanta and then Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley, Lincoln could have lost the election of 1864. And had McClellan won, he would have sued for peace, and we might not have the United States as we know it now.
So what political leaders do you most admire?
Well, again, there have been a number, I think, that have gotten big ideas right over the years, and certainly those who are on Mount Rushmore obviously deserve that. I'm a particular great fan of Teddy Roosevelt. You know, the man in the arena speech has always captured me. The credit belongs to the man in the arena whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. You know, at least if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly and this kind of stuff. You know, FDR, again, another great leader.
Current leaders, are there any people you would like to cite or current leaders you admire?
Well, there are certainly some in Congress that I think have been really very impressive and men of enormous courage, frankly. You know, John McCain, I think, is one who went through an extraordinary, difficult period, obviously in captivity in North Vietnam after he was shot down, endured that, still has the limitations of his motion today. Truly an individual in principle. I remember sitting in his office one time, and I was trying to support a nomination for an ambassador in the area that I was responsible for, and we needed the individual, but anyway, and I realized that, and he pulled out something on that individual and sort of confronted me with it politely. I said, this is a man of enormous principle, and indeed he has been.
Now, what about your legacy? You obviously have a terrific career in public service. Now you're building one in the private sector. But what would you like your legacy to be when people say, this is what David Petraeus was all about?
Well, I don't know. You know, to be candid, I haven't thought that much about that. I'm deliberately staying as busy as I can and trying to focus on the future. Maybe it could be said that he got the big ideas right a couple of times in some pretty critical situations.